Hello, today's podcast is a Paper 3 podcast for Yorkists, Lancastrians and Henry VII looking at local disorder. This is from breadth number 1. So we've already looked at how retaining caused many problems in the Wars of the Roses, as it allowed armies to get incredibly large and certain men and families to become incredibly powerful. The prime examples here are Suffolk, Somerset and the Percys, as well as Richard, Duke of York, and of course the Earl of Warwick and Edward IV's brothers. Henry VII was the only king that successfully limited retaining and moved towards a new system of men that were loyal to him and not their families to run England more effectively. Henry VII never faced the problems of the previous kings, although this could be said to be a lot to do with luck of having very little family, as well as his statute against retaining in 1504, allowing only certain nobles to have retainers if they were on a list. So today we're going to look at how well the Crown coped with challenges to local disorder, and in particular we're going to look at the Percy-Neville feud today. These two families define the family feuds that erupted in our period. They were both major landholders in the north. So let's begin our story in 1377. Henry Hotspur was made Earl of Northumberland. During this time, the Nevilles were helping the kings in wars in Scotland, and they got money and power from this, so grew along the same time. The two families were very close in location, but in the north, and were therefore probably always likely to fall out in some way. However, things got worse because of 1403 and Hotspur's rebellion against the king, which ended in Henry Percy dying at the Battle of Shrewsbury, being named a traitor and losing his lands back to the crown. However, from 1416 to 40, under their grandson, the Percys managed to regain most of their land, under the kings Henry V and Henry VI the most. The Nevilles, however, had gone from strength to strength during this time. Richard Neville became Earl of Salisbury and was on the King's Council by the 1440s, and his son made an amazing marriage that made him what would become Warwick, the Kingmaker, and he became Earl of Warwick aged 21, giving him massive estates in the Midlands. This outraged the Percy family, who knew that when Warwick eventually inherited his father's Richard Neville's lands and the title of Earl of Salisbury, Warwick would be an incredibly powerful man. Despite the older generation of families being upset, it was actually the younger ones that caused the problems in this period we're going to look at. So let's start with Northumberland's sons. His three sons were Thomas, who becomes known as Lord Egremont, Ralph and Richard Percy, for once not only called Henry. The Nevilles were the two younger sons, Thomas and John. Richard, Earl of Warwick, is not involved in this. The trigger of this violent part of the feud was actually a marriage. In 1453, Thomas Neville was betrothed to Maud Stanhope, and Maud was the heiress of a guy called Lord Cromwell. He had received Percy lands from Henry VI, and this had upset the Percys, who were currently in a legal dispute to get these lands back. They were concerned that obviously these would now go to the Nevilles during this marriage. In June and July of 1453, Egremont and John Neville were openly hostile and often attacked each other via their retainers. Henry VI even had to have them go to court to explain their actions, but he was so weak both men ignored the king and carried on anyway. In the summer of 1453, the king suffered his first mental collapse, and it was this time that the Neville-Stanhope marriage was going to take place. On the 4th of August, the Nevilles were returning from their wedding party and were attacked by a large force of retainers led by Egremont and Richard Percy. They attempted to assassinate the Earl of Salisbury as well as the newlyweds themselves. We do not know if the Earl of Northumberland was involved in this. There is no evidence to say he was or he was not. We do know that a sheer amount of people were involved, because we know that 710 Percys retainers were named in the legal documents that proceeded by the Nevilles against them. The Nevilles, because as well of having a large amount of retainers, managed to escape, but our violence continued into that winter as well. This assassination attempt shows how completely law and order had broken down in the reign of Henry VI, and also how retaining made situations so much worse. Richard, Duke of York, during this time wanted to become protector and the Nevilles decided to support this claim. York, however, was not a popular man, and he immediately came to blows, although not physical, with the Queen. Margaret worked with Somerset to exclude York, and they were supported by the Percys, and the Percys also convinced Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, to support them. In January 1454, all the leading opponents arrived at Parliament in a show of strength with their retainers. It was focusing on who should rule for the king during his mental collapse. York was made protector. The Nevilles became super strong at this point. Richard Neville was made chancellor, angering the Percys, who then went to get support in the north for a rebellion against York. York himself went to face the rebellion with Cromwell and broke it up, but it was impossible to make charges against anyone involved stick or to make arrests in the north, which were Percy-dominated lands. York did manage to capture the Duke of Exeter and imprison him in Pontefract Castle, because where else does anyone get imprisoned during this course? Violence continued that autumn, with accounts of violence between families at Stamford Bridge, although there were no confirming details about what actually happened there. However, by the end of 1454, Henry regained his senses and released many of the prisoners, including Exeter and Somerset. York began to plot to get his influence over the king back, and we eventually see the first Battle of St Albans in May 1455. Here, the Earl of Northumberland was killed, Egremont captured, and Exeter captured a bit later on. However, Yorkshire was full of violence, and Egremont and Exeter escaped sometime during 1456. However, by this point, both were too weak to fight the Nevilles in York, and later they saw little point in fighting due to the decreasing amount of York's power when Margaret of Anjou took control over Parliament. All the parties then took part in Love Day in 1458, a sham of reconciliation between the warring families where everyone held hands and pretended to play nice with each other. This isn't the end of our story with the Percys. Problems actually continue with them all the way through the course, and they are vital to the success and failures of different members of our course. For example, not supporting Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth led to Henry VII's victory there. So they still become massively important. The Nevilles lose everything after the Earl of Warwick's failed rebellion in 1461.